Welcome to episode 49 of the How to Japanese podcast. It's March 2024. We made it. I'm going to start today with the main topic of my newsletter this month, but toward the end, I'll have a little grab bag of iro content, just like at the end of the newsletter. So stick around for that, especially if you're interested in my latest Mercari, which is the Japanese app for selling items, basically the equivalent of eBay. And I've got another recommendation there for all the used book sickos out there. So if you're interested in that, stick around to the end. But first, this month I wrote about a word that for me kind of bubbled up from the ether. You know, language is so funny. I have vivid memories of learning certain specific words, either in class or through encounters, and others just kind of take form within your mind, within your thinking, within your language, without you even realizing it. And sometimes that's the case when you use a word that you know how to use, but you don't know why you know how to use it. It's a kind of something that's unique to language, I think. And this month I wrote about one of those words. And I think this will also be obvious to longtime listeners and readers who've been reading my writing for a while. But often when I choose a topic to write about, I'm kind of educating myself through the writing process. It's something that I've chosen because I'm curious about it. I'm not always writing from the perspective of an expert, but I tend to write myself into knowing more about the word than I did initially. And I think that's really the important part. And so often when I'm looking at a word like this that kind of bubbled up from within that I came to know without even realizing it, I'm looking at, why did I come to know this word? What's the background? Why is that important? And how did I come to know this word? And I've developed, I think, a reasonable instinct for words like this that are interesting or kind of have something more than meets the eye, something underneath the surface that's valuable to look into. And I go into it hopefully inquisitively to kind of figure out what is there. And that ended up being the case this month. I wrote about the word kakuhai. Kakuhai. This is a word you've likely seen on menus somewhere and you probably didn't even realize it. That's where I encountered it, at least. The other place that you might have seen it is on advertising copy in a commercial or on packaging somewhere. The place where I am pretty sure where I first saw this word was at a kushikatsu restaurant here in Osaka. Kushikatsu are basically Osaka's lesser known soul food. Everyone knows about okonomiyaki and takoyaki, but I'd say that kushikatsu are actually more frequently eaten. And I'm not willing to put money on this, but just from my own experience, I think you see more kushikatsu places in Osaka, and that could even just be because they take up less real estate. Kushikatsu are fried skewers, and unlike okonomiyaki, which require, often a table with a grill on it, so a lot of real estate space, kushikatsu you could easily serve over a counter with a central vat of oil where everything is fried. To the skewers, it's not just skewers of chicken or not just skewers of beef or pork. It's everything. It's chicken, pork, beef, seafood, veggies, dipped in batter and fried. And you order as you go. That's the one thing that I realized is that if you order a bunch at one time, inevitably some will get cold as you don't eat them as they sit there. So you want to order a couple at a time and keep adding to them as you go. But I noticed one of these restaurants, one of my very first days moving to Osaka, called Shichifukujin on the Tenjinbashi Suji Shotengai. This is the longest shopping arcade in Japan, and it runs north to south, kind of just north of the central business area, just east of Osaka Station and south of Shin Osaka Station. So I kind of marked it on my Google Maps because it looked like a decent place to get kushikatsu. And I checked it out a couple months after being in town because it was still kind of COVID times and I wanted to get a good start at my job without having an extended illness. So I didn't really eat out for a while, but I started kind of eating out, maybe September, October. So, a month or two after I moved here. And this place, Shichifukujin, was a suntory joint. And a lot of izakaya will do this. They'll contract with breweries, and in exchange for offering only Asahi products or only suntory products, they will get, free beer, glasses to serve from, probably discounts, and I imagine even like dispensing machinery, maybe, inspections for the equipment, the taps, the lines, replacements, things like that. And Shichifukujin has a couple of spots. They're all kind of around JR Tenma Station, which is near this Tenjinbashi Tsuji Shotengai. And they offer premium malts as their base beer, and they offer suntory whiskeys as their liquors. And so you can get a highball made from Yamazaki or Hakushu, or their flagship whiskey, which is called Kakubin. And this, I think, is where I learned the word kakuhai, which is, of course, a highboru, made with Kakubin whiskey. So I haven't really, this is because this is an audio podcast, I haven't explained the pieces of kakuhai yet. Kaku is the word for horn, I think, but also corner, and is used in words like kakubaru, which means like jagged, or kakugata, which means like square or oblong or rectangle. And kakubin is the name of the whiskey that I mentioned. Bean means bottle. And here, so kakubin being the whiskey, highboru being the name of highball, which is a cocktail made from a base liquor and usually some kind of carbonated beverage or juice. It turns out Kakubin is the most popular whiskey in Japan. It's a blended whiskey that dates back to 1937 and was initially called Suntory Whiskey Juninen, so Suntory Whiskey 12 year. I doubt it was actually a 12-year whiskey. I think the dating was different at that point, and Suntory had really only started experimenting with whiskey around that point. But the basic story is that at the time, Scotch was the predominant form of whiskey on the market, and it wasn't very approachable. I mean, maybe it still isn't approachable, but at the time, especially when whiskey was very, very new to Japanese consumers, the Suntory was trying to find something that would be better balanced for a Japanese palate at that point. And they developed this one, and it became a big hit. And the name, supposedly Kakubin, the name, is one that supposedly bubbled up kind of from drinkers because it references the shape of the bottle. The bottle has this yellow label on it. It has the signature of the Suntory creator, whose name is escaping right now, but I think it's Tori, is his last name, because Tori's is their other kind of canned highball brand. It's got a yellow label and a hexagonal pattern, which in Japanese is often called kakugata, square, oblong, rectangular, or kakubata. It's the kind of past tense descriptive form of kakubaru, using that same kanji, square, angular, jagged. And so kakubin was the way that people referred to the bottle holding the liquor. They noticed this and they combined it with bean for bottle, creating this kind of brand that Suntory would later go on to patent in a long, complicated legal process. Or so it said. There seems to be a 1932 Suntory whiskey that was also called Kakubin. So I wonder when the bottle was initially created and what the first whiskey was that was referred to as Kakubin. Those were two things that I was kind of not able to nail down during my kind of like shallow dive into Japanese whiskey. But at any rate, this Kakubin whiskey is essentially the whiskey that saved the market for whiskey in Japan twice. The first was in 1937 when it became incredibly popular, and this kind of alternative to peaty, smoky Scotch whiskeys. And from that point, it went on to become a Navy specified good during the war, which helped Suntory during some pretty rough years for companies. and the whole country. And the second time was in 2008. At this point, the Showa whiskey boom is basically over. Between 1998 and 2008, people who had drunk whiskey within the past year fell from 70% to below 40%. So you can see people are kind of, the markets are changing. The interest in whiskey is decreasing. It was a drink for a different generation, essentially. Younger drinkers weren't interested in the establishments that served whiskey that their parents were going to, and they also weren't interested in drinking something that was as strong as whiskey was. So in 2008, Suntory began a campaign to popularize the highball, starting with a set of commercials that feature the actress Koyuki as a bartender. There's a couple of customers sitting at the bar. There's a song playing that they've commissioned that's kind of talking about whiskey, and they order a kakuhai highball and watch as Koyuki makes it. And they really went the extra mile, and there's a whole song and dance. And I linked to it in the newsletter that I wrote this month. Worth going to watch. It's pretty interesting. There's a couple different variations of the commercials they put out, but what they do is they do two things. I think they first of all create a permission structure to order a highball when you're out drinking. In Japan, the first drink market is dominated by beer, and that's best shown, I think, by the phrase "toriaezu nama" or "toriaezu biru," which just means beer for now, or I'll have a draft beer for now. And what Suntory needed to do is they needed to overcome that to a certain extent. They needed to say, if you're out and you're drinking, it's okay to not have a beer, to have a highball instead. And I think the commercials encourage that. They're also instructional. There's one that actually shows drinkers how to make a highball. One is just a very simple commercial. It's not at a bar or anything. And it's just Koyuki, putting ice in a glass, pouring, a little bit of whiskey, and then topping it with soda water, and telling them, 1 part whiskey, 4 parts soda water. And so this is also enabling drinkers to make them themselves, maybe potentially decreasing that intimidation factor that consumers might have when they go buy a bottle of this. And actually, you can buy very small bottles of Kakubin whiskey. I bought one the other day for just 600 yen, and it's probably only, maybe 4 to 6 ounces, or maybe 8 ounces max. And I saw a guy on TikTok make a highball with one of these the other day. So they're still quite popular. But this, combined with, I think, deploying highball dispensers to izakaya, was a massive success. And actually, that's a strategy they use, I think, when they first put out their whiskeys. They would do these tastings at specific bars in Ginza. And the same is true with this highball thing. There's a restaurant that I linked to in Ginza in the newsletter that was essentially one of the kind of starting points of this highball boom that started in 2008. And these dispensers that Suntory was producing, and I imagine probably like renting out at very low prices to some of these izakaya, or discounted prices, especially if they're only serving Suntory products, enable these bars to turn out these drinks really quickly. They're set at really high pressures, champagne pressures that you probably couldn't get with just a CO2 tank alone. And the success is really clear when you look at the Google Trends data, which I linked in the newsletter. A search for kakuhai, that word, it doesn't even register until 2008, which is when that advertising campaign began. And it shows a significant spike then, and then a kind of gradual growth to the present, with kind of ups and downs along the way, and another spike in 2014, which I believe corresponds to when they changed the woman in the commercial for the third time. So they started gradually switching out Koyuki for other actresses, and it became a big PR moment for them. And they called them the so-called Madonnas, was the term that they use in Japanese. The women that would appear in this position were called the highball Madonna or whatever. So it became this kind of regular thing that Suntory was putting on. And Yeah, so it's very, very interesting to see how effective this ad campaign was, and you can see they're going right after beer because in the commercials, the language they're using is exactly kind of what I mentioned, trying to get past that first drink um, kind of moat that beer has, right? And the language they used was "Yoru wa highball kara hajimaru." Yoru wa highball kara hajimaru. The night starts with highballs. So here again, it's not exactly the same phrasing, but then they go on in a different commercial to say toriaezu highballu, which is again borrowing that language. Toriaezu highball, highball for now. The night starts with highballs, highball for now. This is language that's giving drinkers permission to say, I don't want a beer. Maybe that's a little bit heavy for me right now. I'll have a highball. And I did that the other day. When I went out to Kushikatsu, I went to the Baird Beer Brewery after, having a little snack at Kushikatsu first. And I was like, I don't want to be drinking beer all night, so I'll start with a highball. And it's super refreshing. I really enjoy them. You can do a lot with them too. And so this campaign was so successful that in 2010, Suntory had to adjust their whiskey sales volume because they were having trouble keeping up with demand. It's pretty impressive, and what I kind of, in order to kind of convey how big a deal I think this is, you'd have to imagine if Jack Daniel's artificially created the term Jack and Coke. I think that's kind of what this is the equivalent to. If Jack Daniels was doing terribly, if they had like gone really downhill in the 90s and just wasn't selling to anyone anymore, and they had this massive like Don Draper inspired marketing campaign where they said let's serve Jack and Coke, and they had this collaboration where they got this phrase that didn't exist previously into the consumer mindset, and now it's just kind of this thing that's out there and exists and is increasing in recognition and everything. Like that's what it's the equivalent to. I think it's really, I think, probably one of the biggest marketing successes in Japan in the last 20 years or so. And that's more or less the end of the story, to be honest. The most interesting thing to me, kind of so that's where we are now. Highballs, you can buy them in cans, which I don't think was available, 20 years ago. You can get them just about anywhere you go. And looking at how this has gone, though, there's a couple things that are interesting to me as somebody who's interested in brewing beer and the kind of drinks market. In that, first of all, it predates the big whiskey boom. Obviously, there was a big whiskey boom where there was a period, I think, where there wasn't interest in whiskey. The market had kind of bottomed out. And so, especially, in the 60s and 70s, whiskey was being sold in the U.S. for like really cheap and in all these weird containers. And then even in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't that much of a premium on whiskey. But in the 2010s, I think that's when it starts to get kind of priced up. And you start to see from 2010 to 2015 is when prices of Japanese whiskey in particular start to go really crazy, doubling, tripling, things like that. The other thing that's interesting to me is that it kind of predates the sparkling water and seltzer trends in the U.S. Obviously, Japan has sold chuhai, shochu highballs in cans since 1984, and shochu and whiskey have been cut with water, as mizuwari is the word for when you cut it with water, and oyuwari if you cut it with hot water. Mizuwari has been around for a long time. Oyuwari, according to some of the Japanese links I'm seeing, became popular in the 1970s. But I think it's pretty unmistakable that kakuhai had an international effect and was able to jump internationally from Japan to the U.S. In August of 2018, for example, the New York Times publishes an article called "It's Highball Season. Here's where to try some of the best in the U.S." And I pretty distinctly remember like the Japanese highball being a thing that kind of jumped from Tokyo to New York and then kind of through the American drink scene. And then obviously from there, I don't know the direct effects, but you can imagine that having some kind of seeding interest in seltzer water, in alcoholic seltzer, Chuhai-like drinks that had been available in Japan for decades, but weren't really available in the U.S. in any kind of form that you would want to consume. I would say, other than like wine coolers and Zima, which are, I think, widely considered pretty terrible. But now, yeah, it's interesting. I think canned cocktails very much a thing now in the U.S. Um, and glad they're here. It's going to be interesting where things go from now, because I think the only kind of constant you see in a market like the drinks market is change. The only thing that's constant is change. Things will just continue to change. Consumer tastes need to be stimulated with novelty. Companies are going to try and get one up each other and produce something better. The biggest evidence of this is obviously that, well, not obviously, I should say, that is, I saw someone report that Asahi Superdry is going to be changing the shape of their can. They're going to be putting out the Smart Can, which is, that's not the intelligence of the can, it's the form of the can. Smart in Japanese meaning slim, smato. And so this is a slimmer form can that looks a lot like energy drink cans. It's going to have 355 milliliters. And I should shout out Reuters reporter, I think Reuters, I'll have to correct that if I get that wrong. But Geroid Reedy, he posted this on Twitter, but it'll have 355 milliliters. So you'll get an extra 5 milliliters of Asahi Superdry for buying it in this form. It'll be interesting to see if that sticks or if it's just a temporary thing. It does seem like Superdry has stuck with that new can where you rip the whole lid off. That's continuing to be on the shelves alongside the normal cans. It will be interesting to see what they're planning to do with this, if it's just a kind of, one of these short-term marketing plans that all the big beer companies have to go through to kind of maintain consumer attention. And I think you'll see that same thing with their whiskey lines, Superdry obviously being Asahi, but here, what is Suntory going to do with Kakubin? Are they going to sit pat or, put out more stuff? This is one of the things that you can kind of only see in 5-year chunks. So we'll have to kind of be sure to look back and see where things go. So that was the newsletter this month. On the blog, I did a little follow-up with looking at the Oyuwari trends data. This was absolutely fascinating, and I think even more interesting than the data I found for Kakuhai. It resembles the Kakuhai data. It starts slightly earlier in maybe 2004. There's a kind of origination point there, and it gradually increases to the present day, but it has these incredibly distinct seasonal arcs. You can see it go up and down, whereas there's a lot of noise in the Kakuwari one where it's just kind of zzz, where the Oyuwari one is very clearly like a sine wave that with gradually increasing and decreasing peaks, with the peaks hitting every year in December / January. It's really amazing, because what it shows me, at least, is it starts getting cold. People are like, I could use an Oyuwari. How do I make an Oyuwari? Let me Google that. It's pretty amazing. And I did Google it and found some cool information. I found, which I've linked on the blog. It links about how to make the best Oyuwari. They have a temperature formula, and they recommend the kind of, and they give you a formula. What temperature is your shochu? What temperature is your Oyu? And then they show some research about whether people are pouring the hot water in first or the shochu in first, and that varies by prefecture. And they give the listings for all of Japan, and then they give the listings for Kyushu by specific prefecture. And I'm not going to give any spoilers here. Go to the blog, take a look, go visit the website that I linked there. But I post an image from that on the blog, and but I don't think you'll be surprised when you see that image. And I would say I'm inclined to follow Kyushu's lead here with which do you pour first, the hot water or the shochu. And then I've got two more iro topics for you today. The first is a cooking recommendation that I've been meaning to talk about or write about for months now. I think probably since last November. And it's this: if you're not making cornbread in your rice cooker, if you have a rice cooker, whether you're in Japan or in the US, anywhere, if you're not using it to make cornbread, you're not using your rice cooker to the full extent. It's so easy and fast, and the results are so good that there's really no excuse. So as I mentioned, I started this last November for Thanksgiving after being inspired by a rice cooker recipe book. After I did my Murakami podcast last year, I had acquired all these Murakami books that I went and offloaded one day at Book Off. And as they were kind of assessing the price they were going to give me for this giant stack of, I think, probably 20 or 30 books, I was looking around, trying not to just blow the couple hundred yen that I was about to get immediately, but also, of course, I'm in a bookstore, I'm going to look around. And I found a book about how to make basically anything like okazu and other stuff, non-rice stuff, in the rice cooker. And one of the recipes at the end, there were kind of some baked goods, and one of them was cornbread. So I was like, okay, that's genius. I've got to do this. The recipe in my book, however, includes sugar and canned corn, which are two big no-nos for me as someone from the American South. So I kind of audibled, and I used that as a base recipe, but I also used an American recipe that I've been using for years and kind of like did a half and half there. I linked both of those on the newsletter this month, so go check that out. You know, the American one uses sour cream. I either use sour cream or yogurt. The American one also uses both baking soda and baking powder, and I use both of those. Here's another tip. If you're in Japan and you need baking soda, baking powder, very easy to find at most grocery stores. Baking soda, not always as easy to find, but if you go to the pharmacy, you can find it there. You do have to tell them you want the baking soda that you can eat, because apparently there's baking soda for cleaning as well, and they're two different things, supposedly. I don't know. I haven't looked too closely, but conveniently though, the baking soda for eating, for medicine, for medical purposes is sold, I think, as digestive aid and or heartburn medicine kind of, and it's sold in these little packets, which are about, like, I would say probably somewhere between half a teaspoon and a teaspoon, and they're kind of perfect. I rip one off and I pour it in the recipe and I'm good to go. The hardest thing to find, though, even harder than baking soda, is cornmeal. It's not in grocery stores here, but you can get some on Amazon. I've used in the past the same kind of cornmeal that's used for tortillas, but also it's usually very finely ground cornmeal, but you can get the regular cornmeal too that's not ground quite so finely. You can also buy it from the cooking retail store Tomizawa Shoten, which is known as Tomiz. Not sure exactly how you pronounce that. Tomiz. If you search online for that, it'll pop up. They sell, they're all over Japan. They had one in Yokohama when I was living there, and then they have one at Umeda in Osaka, and they sell these 100-gram packets of cornmeal, which are 100 grams is what the recipe calls for, and so they're perfectly portioned for one recipe. But you could also buy a big bag and just use that. That's the only cooking recommendation I have. You'll have to figure out what goes with the cornbread, but mix it all up, throw it in your rice cooker, and put it on the cake setting, which on mine just takes about 40 minutes. But I think if yours doesn't have a cake setting, you could probably just cook it on the regular setting and either stop it after 40 minutes or just let it go until it rings, and you'll be good to go. And then you can figure out what goes with the cornbread after that. And thank you for sticking around. If you've lasted this long, you're one of the 15 to 20 people, I think, who listen to these podcasts regularly. I appreciate all the time you spend with me. And so this recommendation is for you, the true used book sickos out there. I am one of you. I previously talked about Mercari, right? This Japanese equivalent of eBay, but even better, very easy to use app. Um, Great kind of used item, garage sale mindset with, limited number of these kind of semi-professional slash professional marketplace type setups, but still, very, very, I would say, egalitarian in a way that maybe eBay isn't anymore. Um, but I have this crippling Mercari addiction. I check it daily to see if items I've highlighted are cheaper than they were the day before. I check my saved searches to see if anything new has popped up. And thanks to these efforts, I was recently able to acquire a pristine copy of Susanna Clarke's Piranesi for 800 yen. This is, I think, a sci-fi book that came out in 2020 that a friend recommended to me, and there were no copies on there initially when I searched. But I saved the search and I checked like every day, every day, every day. And then one morning last week, there were two copies, one for 800 yen and one for like, I think, 1200, 1400 yen. And so I grabbed the 800 yen without even trying to negotiate the price down, which is something you can do on Mercari. And they even have these kind of like set phrases that you don't even have to like type anything. You can just press a button and it'll fill in a phrase. I'm considering buying this. Would you reduce the price for me? Um, but that was great, right? Like obviously you can use it to do all these things. And so now I can read this book next. But the used book secret that I've found is from Mercari's recommendations. So it will start understanding what you're looking for based on things you've purchased and items you've viewed. And, that's all very normal. But at one point I saw that it was suggesting Yosho, which is literally Western books, Yosho. The word for Western, Yo, and Sho being the word for books. And I clicked on it and was kind of immediately shown all these mostly English used books. And I really felt like I was browsing books at a garage sale or a kind of used bookstore that wasn't very judicious about their selection. They were just, yeah, we'll take every used book you got. And if you sort this into atarashi jun, you can choose how you can sort it from cheapest to most expensive, which is an interesting way to browse. You can sort it from expensive to most least expensive, which is also an interesting way to browse. But I think newest is atarashi jun is one of the most effective ways to search because you're seeing these books that just pop up. You can grab anything before somebody else picks it up, and you really get a sense of like whether people are kind of like taking items down and putting them back up, because you'll see these items like go offline for a little bit and then come back. And so that I would say is I don't have the search saved, but I do find that it's more or less saved because Mercari will always recommend Yosho as a search category for me. So that is my used book recommendation for Mercari, especially if you have that crippling addiction to buying stuff, especially books, like I do. It's a great place to kind of like get a little bit of a methadone hit from that, like to go say, okay, I'm in the position where I could potentially purchase something. That's enough for me today. I don't actually have to buy something. I can just go look at the books on Mercari. I can go look at the used books and potentially be in that position and then step back from the edge a little bit. That's kind of what I'm using Mercari for these days. And I hope that this is something that might be helpful for you as well. Thanks again for spending some time with me this month. Hope you all are doing well, keeping warm still. Still a little bit chilly here in Japan. We had some snow in the past weeks, flakes in the last week, but things are looking up. It looks like we're getting cherry blossoms starting next week here in Osaka. So hope you all are making plans for that because it is coming up soon. And I don't remember what it was like last year. I think it was still kind of not fully locked down, obviously, but they weren't, I don't remember if they were like prohibiting public hanami like they were the couple years before that. But I imagine this year it's going to be no holds barred hanami, and I'm looking forward to kind of going out, sitting under some trees, and having a kakuhai or two, perhaps. We'll see you next month.